Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. I found this remote Airbnb cabin deep in the woods outside of Austin, Texas. The listing made it sound perfect, isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees with a beautiful view of the countryside. I'd have a week of nothing but nature, fresh air, and my thoughts. The host was nice enough, but she did give me a strange warning when I booked. "There's no cell service up here," she said. "You'll need to bring a landline phone if you want to stay connected. I wouldn't recommend walking too far into the woods either. People have gotten lost before." I didn't think much of it. There were a couple of other warnings too about wildlife and the weather, but none of that fazed me. I figured if I was careful, I'd be fine. I didn't even think to check reviews of the place. Big mistake. The drive up was beautiful. The road was winding, lined with thick trees, and the air was fresh, like something straight out of a movie. I got there just before sunset. The cabin was exactly as advertised. Small, rustic, and tucked away in a clearing. It was made of weathered wood and had a large porch with a couple of rocking chairs. I remember thinking, this is perfect, just what I needed. The host was already there to greet me. She was an older woman, maybe in her 60s. She had a calm, almost eerie presence, and there was something about her eyes that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't put my finger on it. She was nice enough, though, and showed me around the cabin. The inside was cozy, with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. One of them had a window that looked out over the woods. That was going to be my room. Before she left, the host gave me one last warning. Just be careful when it gets dark, all right? Not everyone who comes up here is friendly. That struck me as odd, but I didn't question it. I assumed she was just being cautious. Maybe it was something about the area. She left shortly after, and I was left alone in the cabin. The first night was peaceful. I had some dinner, read a book, and went to bed early. The silence of the place was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. There was no sound at all, no animals, no wind, nothing. Just pure silence. It was strange at first, but I eventually drifted off to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to something that made my blood run cold. At first, it was so faint, I thought I imagined it. A small, repetitive tapping sound. At first, it was so quiet that I thought it could have been the house settling, the wind, or maybe an animal scratching at the door. But then the tapping became louder, more distinct, more urgent. I lay there, frozen. It wasn't the wind or the house creaking. Someone was out there. I held my breath, straining to hear. The tapping continued, but now there was something else. A voice, muffled but clear enough to understand. "Please, let me in," the voice called softly, almost whispering like it was struggling to keep quiet. "I'm coming, you have to help me, please." My heart thudded in my chest. Who could that be? There were no neighbors for miles, nothing but woods and that long dirt road. Why would someone be out there, especially at this hour? I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to call the police, but I remembered with a sinking feeling that there was no cell service out here. I didn't have a landline phone like the host had warned me. The voice grew more frantic. "Let me in, please. I'm not safe out here. They'll hurt me. They're close. Let me in." I didn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. What if someone really was in danger? Maybe I could just open the door a crack, talk to them through the gap. But then, what if they were lying? What if this was all some kind of trap? I listened for a long time, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, just as I was considering what to do, I heard something that made my stomach drop. A sharp scratching noise coming from the back of the cabin. It was slow and deliberate, like someone running their nails across the wood. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but it didn't stop. It kept going, methodical, and then a second noise followed. A thump, a slight bang on the back wall, like something or someone had just knocked against it. I froze. I couldn't make sense of it. There was no way that this was just a coincidence. Someone was out there. Someone carefully out of bed and moved toward the door, not making a sound, holding my breath. I didn't dare open the door to look. I just stayed there, pressed against the wall next to the door, listening. The man outside was still begging, his voice trembling. "I'm not who they think I am. You have to believe me. Please, 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 let me in." Then the scratching at the back of the cabin started up again, louder this time, like someone was trying to climb up to the window. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them steady against the wall. There was nothing I could do. The cabin was old. Everything was old, and the walls felt like they were closing in. Every creak, every thud made my heart skip. I didn't know what they wanted. I didn't know if there were more of them, but I knew I couldn't open the door. I couldn't let them in. The fear was overwhelming, like my entire body was paralyzed, but I stayed as quiet as possible, just listening. The hours dragged on like that, the man outside becoming more and more frantic, pounding on the door, begging for help, screaming now. "I know you're in there. Please, they're right behind me." I sat there, holding my breath, my mind racing, the silence between the thuds and cries growing longer and more unbearable. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The knocking, the scratching, the begging, all of it just stopped. I waited. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe as the silence stretched out. My whole body was tense, ready to bolt for the door if I heard another noise, but nothing came. No footsteps, no more banging, nothing. Eventually, the sun started to rise, and I dared to peek out through the window. The woods outside were still and quiet, like nothing had happened at all. I left that cabin as soon as I could. I don't know if it was all in my head or if it was real, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back to those woods. My girlfriend, Emily, and I decided to rent a cabin for the weekend. Just a little quiet getaway. Something remote, off the grid, so we could disconnect from everything. Our phones, work, the noise of the city. We were looking for some peace, you know? We found this cabin in Texas, deep in the woods. It was kind of an older place, but it looked charming enough in the pictures. No neighbors for miles, nothing but trees and dirt roads. When we arrived, everything seemed fine. The place was exactly like the photos. Wooden floors, big stone fireplace, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a big porch with a view of the forest. It was almost like stepping into a time capsule from the 80s. I liked it. Emily, on the other hand, was a little spooked by how isolated it felt. But once we got settled in, we had a nice, peaceful night. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, the second night, we were watching a movie, just winding down for bed. It was about 10 p.m., I think. I was about to grab another beer from the fridge when, bam! The lights went out, just like that, completely dark. The kind of blackout that makes your whole body tense up, like you're not sure if it's the power cutting off or something else. I immediately thought the fuse box tripped or something. Emily was freaked out. I mean, who wouldn't be? You're out in the middle of nowhere with no phone service, no power, and no idea why it happened. So I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and told Emily I'd check the fuse box. The cabin was small enough that I could get to it in a few minutes. I opened the back door and stepped out into the pitch black yard, the kind of dark where even your flashlight barely seems to make a dent. It was quiet. Too quiet. Not a single animal noise. No wind, no bugs, no nothing. Just silence. As I walked around the cabin to the side, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. You know that feeling when you just know something isn't right, even if you can't explain it? My skin crawled. I didn't really pay attention to it at first. I was just focused on getting to the fuse box and getting the lights back on. But then, that feeling hit me again, stronger this time. Something was moving. Something was out there. I froze. I could hear the leaves crunching behind me. Someone was walking around out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart started racing. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but I didn't see anyone. I started to call out for Emily. My voice cracked in the air, but there was no reply from her. It was like the world had swallowed us whole. My mind was racing. Was I hearing things? Was I just paranoid because of the power going out? That's when I felt it. A cold brush against my arm, something close. I jerked my head to the side, and in the split second it took for me to react, a man lunged at me from the darkness. I didn't even have time to think. My instinct kicked in. I shoved him back with all my strength. His hand grabbed my wrist, but I broke free, stumbling backward toward the door. I was terrified, but I wasn't going to let him drag me out into the woods. I slammed the door behind me, locking it as fast as I could. I turned to Emily, who was now standing in the living room, looking completely panicked. "Are you okay?" she asked, breathless. I don't know," I stammered. I had no idea what just happened, but I knew someone had just tried to hurt me. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, but as soon as the operator picked up, there was a strange static noise on the line. I looked at the phone. No signal. I ran outside again, this time to the front porch, shining my flashlight around, trying to spot any movement. I could see nothing. The yard was still and silent once more. That's when it hit me. The fuse box hadn't just tripped. Someone had tampered with it. They'd intentionally cut the power so I would go outside, so they could attack. It was a robbery, a setup. Whoever that was, they'd been watching us for hours, maybe longer. I started to panic. My thoughts were spiraling out of control. What were we going to do? How long would it be before they came back? We ended up locking ourselves in the cabin for the rest of the night. I wasn't sure if the guy had left or if he was still out there, just waiting for the right moment. I kept checking the windows, the door, the porch, but nothing ever happened again. It was like he disappeared into the woods. The next morning, we didn't stick around to find out. We packed up our stuff and left at the first light. I was relieved to finally get on the road. It felt like a weight was lifted off my chest the further we drove from that place. But there's one thing I can't shake, even now. I don't know who that guy was, but I'll never forget the look on his face as he lunged at me in the dark. I don't think we were the first ones they targeted, and I don't think we'll be the last. To anyone thinking about renting a cabin in the woods, just be careful. You might not be alone out there. I needed to get away. My life in the city was suffocating me. Work, relationships, the constant noise. So I booked a cabin in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods of Texas. I thought it would be the perfect place to recharge, clear my head, maybe do some reading, and just breathe. The cabin was isolated, nestled in a small valley, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to swallow up everything around it. It was small but cozy, with a fireplace, an old leather chair, and a view that stretched out for miles. I had my doubts about going alone, but I really needed the time to myself. The first night was peaceful. I set up my stuff, made a small fire, and just sat there, staring at the flames. There was no one around for miles, just the sound of the crackling fire and the occasional chirp of a night bird. It was beautiful in its silence. I felt safe. Almost too safe. Like I could be the only person left on Earth and it wouldn't matter. I woke up the next morning to sunlight pouring through the cabin windows. It was warm, comforting. The woods outside were still and quiet. I took a walk around the area to explore, hoping to get some fresh air and shake off the lingering thoughts of the city. It was just me and the trees, nothing but peace. But that night, everything changed. I was settling in for bed, feeling good, finally relaxed, like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. I remember locking the doors and checking the windows, just a quick glance to make sure everything was secure. I'd read a few ghost stories that afternoon to pass the time. Stupid, I know, but they were just stories, nothing real. I went to sleep early around midnight. The cabin was warm, the kind of quiet you only get when you're truly alone. But at some point in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a sudden wake up, more like I slowly became aware that something was off. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was nothing, just the wind or the house settling. But then I heard it again, a faint scuffling sound, almost like someone dragging their feet. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't from outside. It was inside the cabin. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible, straining my ears. It was too quiet, too close. The sound came again, this time louder, like someone was moving down the hallway. My chest tightened. I knew then, someone was inside. I don't know how long I stayed frozen, but eventually I felt like I had no choice but to move. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but the screen showed no signal. I cursed under my breath. The closest town was miles away, and my chances of getting any help were slim to none. Then I heard a door creak open, my bedroom door. I was paralyzed. The last thing I wanted to do was confront whoever was in my cabin, but I couldn't just lie there and wait to be found. I had to make a plan. I grabbed the nearest thing to me, a heavy metal fireplace poker, and tried to steady my breathing. Then the door swung open fully. A figure stood in the doorway. I couldn't see them clearly, just the outline of a tall person wearing a dark hoodie. My heart raced. I could hear their breathing, slow and deliberate, like they were waiting for me to react. I didn't make a sound. I barely moved. The figure stepped inside, walking slowly toward me. My mind was racing, trying to think of anything I could do to get out of this. Should I scream? Should I fight? But I was too scared to do either. He spoke then, his voice low and gravelly. I didn't want to do this, but you shouldn't have come here. I didn't respond. My throat felt dry, like I couldn't even force the words out. What was I supposed to say? I tried to back away, but he was faster than I thought. Before I could make a move, he lunged forward, grabbed me by the arm, and shoved me back into the chair I'd been sitting in earlier. I struggled, trying to break free, but his grip was too strong. I kicked and squirmed, but it was useless. "Stop it," he growled. "You're not going anywhere." I kept fighting, but my body felt like it was turning to lead. He was pulling out a rope now, and in a panic I realized what was happening. He was tying me up. I managed to scream once, loud and desperate, but it was quickly muffled when he shoved something in my mouth. A rag. The taste was bitter, like something old, something rotten. I couldn't even make a sound to get help. I was completely helpless. His hands worked quickly, tying my wrists tightly to the chair. It felt like my skin was being pulled too tight. I tried to move, to twist my hands free, but the ropes were too thick. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. "Please, don't," I tried to say, but it came out muffled and weak. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, looking me over like I was just a thing, something to be controlled. It made my stomach churn. Then, just as I thought everything was lost, he walked to the door. The man paused and glanced back at me, a cold smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'll be back," he said. "Stay put." He left the room. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to break free from the ropes, trying to make sense of what was happening. My head was spinning, my body aching from the position I was in. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I didn't know if I had minutes, hours, or days before whatever came next. Then, out of nowhere, I heard another voice. This time, it wasn't the man who had tied me up. It was a second person. I could hear muffled words too distant to make out, but the tone was sharp, almost angry. They sounded like they were arguing. The fear kept making my thoughts scatter. What were they going to do to me? Why had they broken in? I tried to listen more closely, but my mind was clouded with panic. It felt like time was moving in slow motion. Then I heard the sound of footsteps again. The door creaked open slowly, but it wasn't the man I'd seen earlier. This was a different person, taller, thinner, and they were holding something. I couldn't make it out at first, but when the light caught it, I saw that it was a knife. I froze. They didn't speak at first. They just stood there, watching me struggle against the ropes. I was too scared to look directly at the blade. I had to do something, anything, before it was too late. When the figure stepped closer, I saw my chance. They were distracted, focused on making sure I stayed tied up. That was the opening I needed. With all the strength I could muster, I lunged forward, knocking my chair back. I heard a crack when it hit the floor. The figure stumbled back, caught off guard. In that split second, I managed to break one of the ropes, loosening my wrists just enough. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted through the cabin, my heart racing, blood pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't even know if I was being chased. All I could think about was getting out of that place. I ran into the woods, unsure of where I was going, but the only thing on my mind was survival. I found the road. It felt like it took forever, but I flagged down a passing car and begged for help. They took me to the nearest town, and I called the authorities. They went back to the cabin, but by the time they arrived, the two men were gone. There was no sign of them, no evidence that anyone had ever been there at all. The worst part? They never found any fingerprints, no belongings left behind. It was like they had vanished into thin air. But I know what happened. I was there, I saw them, and I'll never forget that night. It was in Texas, deep in the woods, miles away from anything. No cell service, no neighbors, nothing. Just trees, the occasional animal, and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. When I first saw the cabin, it looked exactly how you'd picture a secluded place in the middle of nowhere. Old, a little rundown, but charming in its own way. The owners had a family portrait on the wall, a dusty old rug in front of the fireplace, and a bookcase filled with worn-out novels. Nothing special, but cozy. I unloaded my stuff, made a fire, and settled in. The first few hours were fine, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere changed. The woods weren't as calming as they had been before. The wind picked up, and the trees began creaking and groaning. I figured it was just the usual sounds of a forest at night, no big deal. But then I saw the light. It was faint at first, just a tiny flicker through the trees. I thought maybe it was a car headlight, but I couldn't be sure. There's no way anyone would be out here at this time of night. The light blinked again, this time brighter, almost like a flashlight beam moving around. I wasn't really scared, but I felt uneasy. Who would be out there, and why? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, making my way toward the edge of the property. The beam of light was weaving in and out between the trees, disappearing just as quickly as it appeared. I moved a little further, calling out to see if anyone was there. No answer. Just silence, broken only by the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. For a moment I stood there, feeling like I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just someone passing through. I turned around to head back to the cabin, but that's when I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure just beyond the tree line, standing perfectly still. I froze. The beam of light flickered again, but this time it was pointing directly at me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't even move. I don't know how long I stood there, my eyes locked on the figure before it disappeared into the darkness. My mind raced as I rushed back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. I felt like an idiot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise outside made my heart race. The wind, the branches, the occasional animal. It all sounded like footsteps or someone lurking just out of sight. The next day, I tried to push the fear away. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I spent the day hiking around, exploring the area. The woods were beautiful, peaceful, even with the nagging feeling of being watched lingering in the back of my mind. I found a small stream, sat down by it for a while, and tried to clear my head. That night, I figured I'd be okay. No one was going to show up, right? But I was wrong. As night fell, I was sitting by the fire inside the cabin when I saw it again. Another flashlight beam. This time, it was closer. I could see it moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing, swinging wildly as if someone was rushing through the woods. I stood up, feeling my heartbeat in my throat, and stepped cautiously toward the door. The flashlight moved erratically, getting closer and closer until it stopped, and then there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just dead silence. I waited, but the fear was setting in. I kept telling myself it was probably just some hiker or hunter, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The woods were too still, too quiet. I had no intention of going back outside again, not unless I absolutely had to. That night, I locked all the windows, pulled the curtains shut, and sat by the fire, trying to ignore the sense of dread creeping over me. It was almost like I could feel someone, something, watching me through the walls. Hours passed, and eventually I must have fallen asleep. I woke up to the sound of something scraping at the door. It was faint at first, like fingers running along the wood, but it was enough to jolt me awake. My heart was racing. I waited, listening. The scraping stopped. For a second, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe an animal had wandered up to the door, but then I heard it, a loud knock. 3 distinct knocks on the door. I felt my blood run cold. Who the hell would be knocking on my door at this hour, out here? I grabbed the closest thing I could find, an old iron poker from the fireplace, and crept toward the door. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What if it was just some random stranger? What if they were lost? What if they needed help? But deep down, I knew it wasn't just some lost hiker. There was something wrong about all of this. Then I heard a voice, muffled through the door, but unmistakable. "Let me in. I need help. Please." It was a man's voice, low and rough, like he had been out in the wilderness for days. I froze, clutching the poker so hard my knuckles went white. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stood there, hoping whoever it was would go away. But then the pounding started, harder this time, shaking the door with every strike. "Let me in! Let me in!" I backed away, heart racing. There was no way I was opening that door, not after everything that had turned into bangs. The knocks turned into bangs. It felt like the entire door might burst open at any moment. Then the voice came again, desperate and pleading, but this time there was something else in it. Anger, frustration. "I know you're in there! Open up!" I didn't know what to do. I grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no service. I couldn't call for help. The banging didn't stop. It only grew louder, more violent. I was trapped, cornered in a cabin in the middle of nowhere with someone, something, pounding on the door, demanding to be let in. I didn't know how long I stayed huddled in the corner, but eventually I heard him walk away. The silence was deafening. I waited for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. The next morning, I made a run for it. I packed up whatever I could grab and left the cabin, not caring that I was leaving half my stuff behind. When I reached the main road, I finally managed to get a signal and called the police. It turns out that the man wasn't some random hiker or traveler. He was a wanted criminal, someone who had been hiding out in the woods for weeks, targeting isolated cabins for food, shelter, and whatever he could steal. The police said he was dangerous, armed, and probably watching me the whole time I was out there. They found his camp deep in the woods, along with a few stolen items from other cabins. As for me, I left the area immediately. I didn't even look back. I still don't know what would have happened if I had opened that door. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to the woods alone again. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.